Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be covering the ideas of social status and social hierarchy, and we're starting on page 153 and moving through to page 162. And you may occasionally hear my children in the background. They're playing and they get a little wild sometimes. If you do hear that, my apologies, but it is what it is when you're working from home. Alright, so let's get into social status today. So we talked about social status in chapter 4, and there are status sets. So just to review, and that's a collection of statuses that a given person holds, right? So I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, I'm a parent. Those are two things that are in my status set. Other things would be that I'm a martial artist, I'm a car owner, I'm a homeowner, just several things like that that would be status sets that I'm in. So whatever you do as far as your status, you have a status set, and it's a collection of all your statuses. So my status set includes all of those things. Um, and you have your own status set that includes all the statuses you've achieved, or that you have had ascribed to you. So just to review, when we talked about status, we talked about achieved status, and that achieved status is things that you have done that have granted you a level of status, right? So if you graduate high school, when you do that, right, you will have the status of high school graduate. You had to earn that. Or if you graduate college, when you do that, you had to earn its achieved status. You didn't just get a college degree, you had to earn that college degree. So that would be achieved status. And then there is ascribed status, and ascribed status would be a status that is given to you just by default because of who you are. So the Bush family, right? The name Bush carries meaning with it because it's produced two presidents, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. So there's ascribed status just by default, just by being in the Bush family. All right. Now, something that your book delves into that's new here in this chapter is that not all statuses are equally important, as in they're not seen as equally valuable. They may have importance to the people that hold them, but societally, by and large, as far as our culture is concerned, celebrity status may be more important than high school graduate status as far as the way our society reacts, right? If a new movie comes out with a big celebrity in it, people talk about it, but people don't talk as much about the average person that graduates high school. Now, graduating high school is super important, and it's a status that's achieved. That's a step toward other levels of achieved status. So I'm not saying that high school is important. I think it's very important, but I'm saying our society, the way they respond, seems to respond to celebrity status more so than other status. So not all statuses are seen as equally important in our society, and there's a status hierarchy, right? So in our society, it could be at the top of our status hierarchy could be president or extremely wealthy or big name celebrity, someone that might not have the same wealth as, say, Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but they have a lot of social clout, not necessarily just economic clout, right? And the president has a lot of power and authority, so that grants him status. So these people are at the top of the status hierarchy. And then we have, as far as achieved status, lower levels of hierarchy. For example, the homeless, right? They're not held up as the pinnacle of society. They're seen as lower on the achieved status hierarchy. So there is a hierarchy, and it's one thing your book points out, just to recognize that not all statuses are seen as equal by our culture. And what is a cultural status that is important can vary among cultures. Okay, then there's something called master status that your book covers, and I wanted to land here for just a second to develop this idea of master status. And this would be a level of status that is extraordinary. All right, it's seen as extremely special. So things that the common person can't achieve or won't achieve in their lifetime, or things that set someone apart, like for example being president. There's only one president at a time, right? And there are only a handful of presidents that have served that are still living today in America. So that would be a master status. Or senator would be another one, right? There are only 100 senators at any given point in time that are currently serving in America, and that's out of a population of 320 plus million people. So to be part of that 100 out of 320 million, that would be a sort of master status. So if you're a president, you're not just referred to by your first name, you're referred to as president, right? So for our current president, it'd be President Trump, right? Um, if you're a senator, you're not just referred to by your first name, you're Senator so-and-so, right? Same thing would be, master status could also be seen as like doctor, perchance, where it's a higher status symbol, it's a higher level of achieved status. I think partially because of the amount of schooling that has to go into it, the amount of effort that has to go into it, but also I think because doctors are seen as having a lot of power, because in some sense they seem to have some level of understanding of, so knowledge, and control over, they seem to have illness, things that are mysterious to the average person, doctors seem to have a handle on. So they're granted a higher title. So if you're a doctor, you're not just referred to as Mr. or Mrs., you're Dr. so-and-so. So that would be the idea of master status. And so there, just to summarize that section, there is a status hierarchy, and not all statuses are seen as equal by our society. But what different societies or cultures view as valuable or higher level status can vary. Okay, now let's talk about roles. All right, there are roles that go along with any given status, and sometimes there's something called role conflict. So, for example, I'm a parent. I'm also an educator who is doing distance learning. And sometimes there can be role conflict right there. So I don't know if you heard my kids in the background earlier, right? But I'm educating and my children are here. So sometimes those boundaries come into conflict and the roles that I'm playing may come into conflict there. So working moms would be a great example, right? If you're a single mom and you work, that would be an area of role conflict, mother and worker. So there can be role conflict. It doesn't have to be that apparent. There can be more subtle ways in which role conflict is experienced, but everybody has multiple statuses, so everybody has multiple roles. And with that comes role conflict among those roles. Also, there can be something called role strain, and I see this particularly in my field, but everyone can deal with this. So role strain is like conflicting interests within a role. So for example, as an educator, my goal is to help you learn and to help you grow, to come alongside of you in your learning journey, right? And another role that I have is to grade or to assess, right? So on one hand, I want to help you as much as I can, but on the other hand, I have to give you a score for what you have learned. So there can be role strain, like balancing that, where I have to meet the objective standard for the grading and assessment, but on the other hand, I want to offer as much help and guidance as I can. But I can only take either of those so far, right? I'm not able to offer so much help and guidance that I take your assessments for you, right? That would be unethical, right? But on the other hand, I can't be so firm in assessing that I never offer any help or guidance. So that's role strain and trying to find balance among the various subtleties of a role or the nuances of a particular role. Okay, now let's talk about social networks. All right, so we all have social networks, and social networks are just ways in which or means through which we connect with other people or network, right? So social networks serve several roles in our lives, or they provide several things to us, and your book covers this. One thing is that they provide a haven, right, like a safe place where we can belong. Another thing that they can be seen as, your book calls bandages, like this would be like an emotional support group, for example. Like you had a bad day, you can talk to your friends in your social network, and they may help you through that. So that'd be bandages. Um, Safety nets. So like, if you're having a rough go of things, for example, your family. If you lose your job, your family might be a social network that could be a safety net for you. That could say, hey, you can come live with us for a little bit while you get back on your feet. That would be another role of social networks. And one other role of social networks can be social capital that your book points out, which is the idea that being a part of a network can set you up to advance further in life. So some ways that you can see this would be peer networking in a given field. So like if you're an educator and you network with other educators in your field, they may be able to help you when new opportunities come up, right? So like they might know someone who can get you into a new program, like a master's program somewhere or a PhD program somewhere in your field, and you would not have had that connection had you not networked. So moving on from that topic, something your book points out is when we have social networks, more often than not, the social phenomenon that occurs is homophily, which is homo is same, Philly, like Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. So love, loving the same. So it's the idea that we tend to gravitate toward people who are similar to us or have similar interests to us, or even are in similar social statuses or socioeconomic levels. So when we social network, generally what the social sciences show is that we tend to gravitate toward people more so who are like us in some ways than who are unlike us. That's not to say that we won't have people in our social groups or in our social networks who are different than us, right? You might be someone who's middle class and you have someone who's extremely wealthy in your social network. But you're not going to be a middle class person who's in a predominantly very, very wealthy social network generally. These are generalizations because they break down at some point. There are always exceptions to generalizations, but what the data does show is that this is a trend. So the data supports the idea of this, that we tend to gravitate in social networks toward likes as opposed to unlikes. Okay, so social groups. Let's talk about primary versus secondary groups, because there are two kinds of social groups. There are primary social groups, and these are groups that when we're networking, we have a social network or a social group. We have a primary group, and that would be, an example of a primary group would be someone you hang out with a lot. And you do so, you have regular contact, and it's generally personal in nature. That would be a primary group. Like a friend group or a family group would be considered a primary group. Secondary groups are more impersonal, and they're generally task oriented, right? So this could be like if you work at a big company and you have a group project for the company. That group project for the company may be a secondary group, right? Because you're probably not going to socialize as much if it's a big company and you don't see each other very often. And you're getting together to accomplish a specific task. So this would be the idea. You have social groups, but sometimes those social groups aren't primary, they're secondary, and they're task oriented. But those can develop over time into social networks, but your book's just pointing out that just because you're in a group of people doesn't mean that it's a primary social group. All right, it can be a secondary social group that just is getting together for a secondary purpose or some ancillary purpose, not for the purpose of building a social group. Okay, now this is something I think is really cool and that I use in my life, and I didn't really, until I started teaching this class, know what the name of it was. But as far as groups, there are also groups called reference groups. All right, and these are groups that people use to measure themselves against. All right, so a reference group is a group that you reference as a means of seeing where you are in your particular life journey in a particular area. And you can have multiple reference groups. So, for example, if you are into fitness and you're into running, right, you might have a reference group of runners that are at the peak or are better than you, and you measure yourself against them. So you might say this runner runs, let's say they're running like a 5:30 mile consistently pace for a 5K. That's a pretty good pace, right? Like that is world class pace as far as like, well, at least for my age. That's not quite world class for my age, but you're very competitive if you're running a pace like that. The last 5K I ran, the winner ran somewhere around like a 5:02 pace, and that was pretty impressive. And that's been consistent at this 5K for a long time. So that would be a reference group where I'd say, okay, here are my runners. They're better than me. Therefore, I'm measuring myself against them. How much closer am I getting to where they're at? That's a reference group, right? And whatever your thing is that you're working on, a reference group can be a way you measure yourself against them. Now, it can be something more esoteric, right? It can be social status. It could be, followers on social media, and you have a reference group of that, right? It can be likes on social media. It can be anything, but the idea is that you have a group of people that you use as a reference point for your own personal status, with the idea toward advancement. All right, last thing in the lesson today, and that would be digital age social groups. Social media plays a huge role in what we consider to be a social group these days, right? You can, whatever you like, there's something out there for it, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter or any of the other social media platforms. There are ways that you can be part of a community through commenting, liking, subscribing, whatever it is, or making your own content and having people follow you, where we have these groups of people that are associating and communicating, right? But they're not meeting in person. So there can be a less interpersonal, direct, like direct contact, interpersonal, kind of like this, right? We're having personal communication, interpersonal communication, but we're not directly meeting in person. And social media is impacting the way in which we define social networks and social groups. So I think that's kind of a cool thing, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in the social sciences. All right, so what I want you to get for today, just real quickly summarize the notes and look at the notes, is social status. Social status is a thing, and social status can affect the social networks we get into and that we develop. So our status can be tied to the way in which we network and the people with which we network. Our social status comes with roles that people expect us to fulfill. And those roles can come into conflict sometimes. Social networks can serve four purposes. They can be a haven, they can be a bandage, they can be a safety net, or they can give us social capital. We tend to gravitate toward people that are similar to us. And as far as social groups go, there can be primary groups, which are more interpersonal, and secondary groups, which are task-oriented. We often make reference groups to compare ourselves to, and social media has redefined what social networking is, what social networks are, and what a social group is. Alright, so that is it for today. I appreciate you guys watching, and I appreciate all the hard work you all have been putting in during this time. Don't think it goes unnoticed. You guys have been doing a great job. Keep up the good work.